Hey everyone, it's Robert Hall, and today I'm going to show you how to update firmware on the Godox products. So right now I'm in the process of recording how-to video guides on pretty much every Godox product that I've never done one before, and one of those would be the original AD600 BM. And before I do it, I want to make sure that I have the most up-to-date firmware for 2020, and I figured while I'm going through the process, I may as well share that with you guys, as well as make some very important notes, because believe it or not, this process can actually completely brick your flash. So I'm going to teach you everything you need to know. First off, I want to talk about the Godox firmware because it's a little bit complex as they've made some changes over the years. So all of the firmware can be had at godox.com/en/download, and I'll leave that linked in the description below. But that has every product's firmware, as well as the launchers, like the firmware launchers that you need to install that. Step one, you're gonna need to go to this site. Step two, you're going to need a data cable. And a lot of people get tripped up here because they're trying to connect it, but what they don't realize is that they're using a simple charge cable. There's no data transmission in really cheap USB cables. You need one that is actually designed to transmit data from one device to another. Also, you have to make sure that that USB cable is the proper connector, because some of these are micro USB, more of the earlier products, and more recently they're now USB Type-C. Step three would be picking the right firmware launcher. There's three of them, G1, G2, and G3 that have come out over the years. G1 is for the original products such as TT865, V860 version 2, X1T, AD600. G2 software is for products like the AD200, AD600 Pro, TT350s, V350s, and the XPro transmitter. And finally, we have the G3 firmware, which has products such as the V1, that's the round head speedlight, the X2T, and AD400 Pro. Now pay careful attention to being brand specific here, because there are some products that one XPro is on the G3 installer and one XPro is on the G2 installer. So for instance, the XPro P for Pentax cameras is under the G3 firmware, but all the other XPros, XPro C, N, S, F, O, all the other ones are under the G2 firmware. If you don't see your light on here, then that simply means that there's no firmware for it. Products such as the TT600 or the V850 version 2 don't have any firmware because they are single pin, so they have no advanced functionality such as TTL, and they're not connecting to any specific camera. They simply fire when they're told to fire. So those don't have any firmware, nothing to look out for there. They don't even have a port for you to connect it to a computer. Now I pretty much have one of every Godox product, so I have all three firmware launchers on my computer, but you can just install the one that you need at the moment. Next up, you may be wondering, how do I even know if I need to update my firmware? Well, on the page, there is a firmware version for every single device. So if I look right now on the page under the G1 firmware update, because I'm trying to do an X1TS, I'm trying to update the firmware on the X1TS, I look and it is at firmware V18, version 18. Now on the X1, the way to check the firmware is to hold down the mode button, turn it on, and I see U-17. That means that the firmware version is 17 on this, so it is out of date. Now, is it critical for you to update your firmware on every version? Not necessarily. A lot of times these are either one minor adjustment to custom functions that you may not use. It could be some type of stability for a specific camera because that camera had an update, or it could be updating a lighting product to make sure that it works 100% with one of their triggers. So if you're not experiencing any problems, you really don't have to update your firmware. Now I'm gonna check the firmware on this original AD600 BM, that's the manual only version. Turn that on, and if I go into the menu in the top right corner, it says version 1.5. Now I've made specific videos on every product, and in most of those I share how you can see the firmware, so check out a specific one if you're lost trying to find it. But if there's a custom functions menu, it's most likely in the top right there. Okay, we are on version 1.5 of the AD600M, and on here we are on version 1.9 is the most up to date. So we are way behind on this, and just so I make sure that my tutorial is accurate, I'm going to go ahead and update this device. So I need to download that specific one. I'm selecting the AD600M version. I'm going to download this right to my desktop just so it's very clear. It's a zip file, so I need to to extract it. And when I extract it, I get a PDF and I get a file that is for the firmware. Now, if I open the PDF, I do get a few details on what each version includes. Now, what I dislike here is in this PDF, it does not warn you exactly what you're supposed to do when you go to update your firmware. So here's the most important part, guys. I'm going to remove the battery from the flash, and I'm going to hold the power button, and you may not have seen that, but it briefly lit up. That's because there was still some power in the device. Now, if you do not do that, when you plug this USB in, you can completely, I don't know what it's called, like short circuit the device. Voltage goes somewhere it's not supposed to. I don't know the technical term, but the point is it's bad. And it can ruin your flash to the point where nothing will show up on the display. You effectively make a brick out of this light, and you'd have to send it in order for somebody else to fix it. So now I have removed the battery and I have tried to turn it on to just get rid of any power that is stored in the device. Now I'm going to open up the firmware. Very, very simple, very ugly firmware page. Switch it to English. I'm going to tap that English button. We're going to select file. We're going to go to our desktop where we put that AD600 file. We see AD600M _ version 1.9. That's the file we want. Loading completed, matching product would be AD600M. So now that we've got that loaded, I'm going to open up top here and I'm going to connect the USB. Once connected, I'm going to hit the connect button on the software. See connect complete. Now I hit upgrade. It erased the original firmware, it wrote the new firmware, and now the upgrade is complete. It literally takes 5 seconds once you download all the other stuff. So now I'm going to disconnect AD600M, device disconnected. I'm going to remove it. We're just going to go backwards here. Now I can put my battery back on safely. And if I turn it on and go into the menu, I'm now on version 1.9. Likewise, on this R2TS, this is the X1T. Yes, you can upgrade Flashpoint products using the Godox firmware. I'm going to remove the batteries. I'm going to flick the device on to get rid of any charge that is stored in there. This one is also micro USB. So I'm going to go back on that firmware updater page. We are going to download the X1TS. Now it's important to make sure that you're getting the specific one to your camera brand. Don't try to put like Canon software on the X1TS. Not going to work. Ultimately, these pins down here control the communication, so you can't just trick it with a different firmware. So we're downloading this to the desktop as well. On my desktop, I am going to find the file. We are going to extract it here again. Here's the two new files. Let's see what version 18 added. Version 18 added to solve the non-triggering problem of N group when triggering AD600 with TTL groups and M groups. So apparently there was some type of stability issue, and this fixed it back in April of 2019. So it's been a while for us to update this. All right, so now we're going to select file again. We've got the X1TS version 18 firmware. Click on it, hit open, loading completed, matching product X1TS. And turn it back off. I'm gonna plug this in. I'm gonna hit connect. Connect completed, upgrade. Erase completed, writ completed, disconnect. That's it. You spend less than 10 seconds once the firmware launcher is actually open. So on to one final discussion point. I know many people out there are Mac users. Just so you know, the G1 and the G2 are only for Windows, and the G3, the reason that came out is because it's for Mac OS products. So what I'm thinking that we're seeing now is as we have a new firmware version, it's being put on the G3 firmware upgrade for both Mac and Windows. But until there is a new firmware version for each of these, then we're not seeing an upgraded one. So hopefully more and more of the products will be added to the G3 firmware. That way users of both Mac and Windows can add it. I know some people have kind of used a Mac but while booting virtual Windows or something. I'll try to find a tutorial and leave that in the description below if I see a good one on the internet. So that's the entire firmware process. It's quite simple, Find out if you need firmware by checking inside your product. You download the appropriate firmware installer and the appropriate firmware for your specific device. You take your battery off, you turn on the device to get rid of any type of power that's still inside the device. You connect with a data cable and then follow the prompts on screen and you'll be done very quickly. Hope this video helped you out. Leave a like if it did, subscribe if you want to see more, and until next time, keep on shooting.